I still remember where I was and what I was doing when I learned Lita had been murdered.
The only way that Sullivan could maintain all of his property and all of his money is that if she voluntarily gave it up or if she was no longer around.
We are here today to announce the issuance of a warrant for the arrest of James V. Sullivan.
I had nothing to do with Lita's death. Her death was a great tragedy, and I thank God and my attorneys. This ordeal is over.
On the morning of January 16, 1987, someone rang the doorbell at the home of socialite Lita Sullivan in Atlanta, Georgia. A man carrying a dozen roses asked if she was Lita, and when she answered yes, he pulled out a gun and shot her in the head. Her best friend was in the house when it happened, and hid in a closet with her daughter until the police arrived. But by then it was too late. Lita Sullivan was already dead. But who exactly was Lita, and why would someone want her dead? The mysterious delivery ending in murder was only the tip of the iceberg in this twisted story of divorce, money, and a runaway husband, and it would take over a decade to be finally solved. Let's dive into the story of Lita Sullivan's murder. Lita McClinton was born in 1952 into a prominent Atlanta family. Her father was a former United States Department of Transportation official, and her mother was a Georgia state representative. She was the eldest of 3 children, and grew up surrounded by politics and social clubs, attending parties and cotillions. In 1975, she graduated from Spelman College and found a job working in a boutique in the mall. Lita loved fashion and felt right at home at her job. It was while she was working in the boutique when 23-year-old Lita met James Sullivan. He was a wealthy 34-year-old divorced businessman with 4 children. James was a frequent customer at the store, and despite the age difference, he and Lita began dating and were soon engaged. Lita's family didn't approve of the relationship. Not only was James much older than she was, but he was also white. Interracial couples were not well received in the South during the 70s from a social point of view. Although the McClintons were a powerful family, black and white social circles didn't usually mix. However, it wasn't all about race. Lita's family also found James arrogant, and even caught him in several lies. They didn't trust him, and thought he could be using Lita for her social status. Despite the family's doubts, Lita and James got married in December of 1976. She continued working at the boutique while he was running Crown Beverage, a company he'd inherited from a relative the year before. In 1983, James sold his business and the couple moved to Palm Beach, Florida, into a multi-million-dollar mansion overlooking the ocean. James was eager to become a part of the Palm Beach social elite, but his climb up the social ladder wasn't going as he expected, and he blamed Lita for this. He said her skin color was preventing him from being someone important. The couple's marriage wasn't as glamorous as they liked to pretend. Lita's friends said she was miserable, and things only continued to get worse when she discovered James was having an affair, or several of them. Lita discovered blonde hairs around her home, and even found a pair of another woman's underwear in her own bed. She was devastated, since she desperately wanted the marriage to work, and she fought hard to keep it alive. She began seeing a therapist to help her overcome the problems in her marriage, but it didn't help. James was also cutting her off financially. Despite his fortune, she didn't have money of her own after quitting her job when they moved, which affected her independence and tied her to him for support. Lita's patience ran out when she discovered James was not only having affairs, but he was hiring sex workers. She ended things with James and moved back to Atlanta, into a townhouse the couple owned in the upscale Buckhead area. When she filed for divorce, she requested 50% of his $5 million estate and began rebuilding her life. She started doing charity work and even dating other men. She was starting over. That is, until January 16th of 1987. Early on Friday, January 16th, 1987, Lita was having breakfast with her best friend Poppy who had spent the night at her townhouse with her daughter. The two were discussing the day ahead of them. Lita was nervous since that was the day of her divorce settlement. A judge was about to decide the final conditions after 11 years of marriage. Shortly after 8 a.m., the doorbell rang. Lita, still in her bathrobe, checked who it was before opening the door. It was a man carrying a box of roses, topped with a pink ribbon. Intrigued by who the mysterious flowers could be from, she opened the door to accept them. The delivery man asked if she was Lita, and she confirmed it was her. However, instead of handing her the flowers, he fired the 9mm gun he had hidden amongst them. Several shots were fired, but one was all it took to hit Lita in the head and send her to the ground. Poppy, Lita's friend, who was upstairs, grabbed her daughter and ran into a closet the moment she heard the gunshots. Unaware if her friend was okay or not, she waited in the closet until police came into the house, alerted by a neighbor who heard the shots and found Lita on the floor. Lita was rushed into an ambulance, barely alive, but it was useless by then. Her wound was irreparable, and she died before reaching the hospital. Before the investigation even began, friends and family suspected James Sullivan was behind the murder. Their marriage had ended in bad terms, and all signs pointed at the divorce settlement being generous with Lita. When police began investigating, they found several signs pointing the finger at James. However, he was still in Florida, and had been for the past few weeks. He was nowhere near Atlanta that morning. Witnesses described seeing 3 men running away from the scene, none of which matched James' description. The florist confirmed the man who bought the flowers was not James, and he mentioned he seemed nervous and left in a car with 2 other men after picking up the roses. However, when following the 3 men's footsteps after the shots were fired, investigators discovered they drove 40 minutes to a rest stop outside Atlanta and used a payphone to make a call. James had received a call at the same time, leading investigators to believe the men were informing him of the murder. It seemed that James had hired hitmen to end his soon-to-be ex-wife's life before the divorce was final and keep all his money to himself. However, the men hadn't been found, and neither was a murder weapon, so it was hard to find evidence to back up the theory. James also told police he had nothing to do with the shots, and he suspected it was part of a drug deal gone wrong. Since there was no evidence to support the theory, he couldn't be held, but police watched James closely for the following weeks and months. During a tapped phone call between James Sullivan and a close friend, he mentioned the caliber of the gun used to kill his wife. This information had not been released to the public, so how did James know what kind of gun was used? Still, the DA thought without identifying the shooters or finding the weapon, nothing could be held against James for the time being. And so, with no further evidence, James was free to go. 8 months after Lita's murder, he married his new wife Suki, who was 13 years younger than him. In 1990, James got pulled over for a traffic violation, and on the day he was supposed to appear in court, he instead sent Suki to claim that she was the one who was driving and blamed the officer who gave the ticket for making a mistake. The judge was obviously furious, and knowing that James was also a suspect in a murder investigation, he decided to give him house arrest. This situation gave Suki the strength to come forward with very interesting information regarding Lita Sullivan's murder. Tired of a marriage of lies and cheating, she filed for divorce and told investigators that James had confessed to her that he had Lita murdered. She said she'd been scared to come forward before because she feared for her life. However, there was still no evidence linking James directly to a murder plot, and since Suki was divorcing James at the time she told investigators he was guilty, they thought she might be trying to get back at him in the middle of an ugly divorce. More attempts to indict him were pursued, but they always led to the same point. There was simply not enough evidence to charge James Sullivan with the murder of his wife Lita. Although James was dismissed of all charges for the time being, the family of Lita stood strong. The McClintons filed a wrongful death claim against James in civil court, attesting that he'd hired the hitmen who shot and killed Lita. James acted as his own attorney, and was found liable by the jury, and it was ruled he would pay the family $4 million. The money, however, would never come, since James claimed he was broke. But what the McClintons really wanted were actions. When was James going to be charged with their daughter's murder? it would still be a few more years, but in 1998, new evidence was finally found. A new lead followed by the Atlanta police in 1998 led them straight to Tony Harwood, who was living in North Carolina. After being identified by one of the neighbors who witnessed the murder and saw the gunman fleeing the scene, Tony confessed that he had been hired by James Sullivan to kill Lita for $25,000 in 1987. The evidence investigators needed to charge James was finally there, and Tony had agreed to testify against him in exchange for a plea deal that got him 20 years in prison. However, when police went to arrest James, he was gone. After living a low-profile life in Costa Rica, James heard Tony Harwood had been arrested and decided to flee the country. There were rumors of sightings in Venezuela and Panama, but never an arrest. He was even in the FBI's most wanted list. It would take a tip leading straight to Thailand to finally find and arrest James Sullivan in 2002. After 2 years in a Thai prison, he was sent back to the United States. 19 years after Lita's murder, the trial began. Why had James hired a hitman to end his wife's life? It seemed that, just as the family and investigators first suspected, Lita was about to receive an amount between $250,000 and $1 million in the divorce settlement. Unwilling to pay a single dollar to his ex-wife, James decided to take her out of the picture altogether. If Lita died, he wouldn't have to pay. Tony Harwood testified against James, confirming they met 2 months prior to the date of the murder. He delivered furniture to the Palm Beach mansion where James was still living. While he was there, James told him he needed someone to, quote, take care of his wife, and the two discussed details in a matter of 2 hours. Tony didn't think he was serious until he received a check for $12,500 in the mail, half the payment they had discussed. Although James wanted her gone before Christmas, Tony had to wait until some of his friends were available to make the drive to Atlanta and go through with the plan. They first planned to kill her in the middle of the night, but they thought she would more than likely not answer the door to 3 strangers so late. That's when they came up with a flower delivery plan. Tony's girlfriend testified and confirmed she had seen James give Tony an envelope full of cash after the plan was a success. Despite the lack of a murder weapon, and the evidence being mostly circumstantial, the jury felt it was enough to find James Sullivan guilty of malice murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tony Harwood, the man who pulled the trigger, got the 20 years he was promised after testifying. The same 20 years it had taken for Lita's case to finally be solved. The McClinton family continued to claim the money they won against James in 2004, but he continued to claim he was broke. Due to interest building up, the amount owed was now $13 million versus the original $4 million. But no money was ever paid up. It's suspected James Sullivan's fortune was hidden in Switzerland, since his attorney was paid from a Swiss bank account, but it has never been confirmed. In 2018, Tony Harwood was released from prison after serving his sentence. James Sullivan is still serving his life sentence in Georgia and is now in his 80s. Lita McClinton Sullivan would have turned 70 this year.